Hey there, amazing friends! I warmly invite you to join me on this exciting journey by subscribing to my channel, liking, commenting, and sharing my videos. Every like, comment, and share brings us closer together and fuels my passion to create more great content. Your support truly makes all the difference. Thank you for being the heart of this community. Jeffrey Dahmer, USA, The Bloody Refrigerator File, the hair-raising confessions of the Milwaukee Monster. A city shaken by whispers, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, by the mid to late 20th century, was a city of steady humdrum rhythms, punctuated by the occasional headline about political feuds or industrial strikes. Breweries thrived, Midwestern courtesy was a point of pride, and typical urban problems, petty crimes, occasionally violent incidents, were hardly unusual. Nothing in Milwaukee's day-to-day life hinted that, behind a bland apartment door in one of its unassuming neighborhoods, a nightmare of unimaginable proportions was unfolding. It was a city that valued propriety, local sports teams, and Friday night fish fries. Yet below the surface, shadows stretched longer than anyone realized. Rumors occasionally floated around about missing men, particularly men of color, and those frequenting the local gay bars in the downtown area. Some families pleaded with police about their missing sons, but in a city grappling with limited resources, their concerns often faded in bureaucratic intrigue or were attributed to runaways who might eventually return. Little did the community realize that these missing person flyers were tied to a single terrifying predator. The name Jeffrey Dahmer was, for a while, just that. A name. A neighbor, a coworker, perhaps just another face in the crowd. He was unremarkable in many respects, soft-spoken, not particularly outgoing, and often overshadowed by the louder personalities around him. Few who encountered him day to day suspected that beneath that low-key demeanor lurked impulses so dark they would eventually catapult him into infamy as one of America's most disturbing serial killers. This is a tale that delves into the life, mind, and crimes of the man who would become known as the Milwaukee Monster. The references to the Bloody Refrigerator File capture the central horror of his case. A chilling compilation of photographs and bodily remains that police discovered upon entering his apartment. This revelation not only astounded investigators, but also shattered the city's veneer of safety, forcing residents to confront the realization that evil can thrive in the most ordinary of places. We begin this narrative by peering into the earliest chapters of Jeffrey Dahmer's existence, long before the term serial killer would be invoked, and when no one could have guessed the scale of the horror that would soon grip Milwaukee. Origins. A childhood marked by unease, Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer entered the world on May 21, 1960, born to Lionel and Joyce Dahmer in Milwaukee. Initially, his childhood appeared relatively ordinary, photographed in typical snapshots: a baby swaddled in blankets, a toddler perched on a swing, a boy with a half-smile at a birthday party. To onlookers, nothing about this young child suggested the monstrous path he would eventually tread. But cracks in the facade began to form early. The Dahmer household was hardly serene. Joyce struggled with mental health challenges, oscillating between moods that left her at times bedridden, at times agitated. Lionel, intensely focused on his work as a research chemist, was frequently absent, physically at times and emotionally at others. The emotional climate of the home was fragile, lurching between arguments and silent Cold Wars. This atmosphere left Jeffrey feeling isolated and withdrawn. From a tender age, Jeffrey exhibited peculiar fascinations. Most notably, he developed an interest in the innards of animals. Where another child might be curious about the bones of a fish, Jeffrey's curiosity extended to dissecting small creatures, roadkill, squirrels, birds, to explore their organs. Family members occasionally brushed off these hobbies as natural curiosity, with Lionel at times even aiding him in bleaching animal bones for scientific interest. Unbeknownst to them, such activities foreshadowed a chilling obsession with anatomical deconstruction that would soon intensify. The family moved to Bath Township, Ohio, when Jeffrey was still young. This transition further disrupted his sense of stability, and he grew more introverted. At school, peers viewed him as shy and somewhat strange. He drifted from group to group, rarely forming deep friendships. Teachers at Revere High School recall him as a student who quietly sat at the back, seldom raising his hand or turning in exemplary work, but not causing any overt trouble either. Behind the silence, however, lurked a mind grappling with unsettling desires. Dahmer would later confess that, during these teenage years, he began experiencing sexual fantasies involving domination and violence. Coupled with an escalating dependency on alcohol, often gulping down hard liquor before class, these fantasies hinted at an evolving internal crisis. But they remained invisible to most, overshadowed by the relatively mundane troubles of a teen from a fractured home. In 1978, his parents' marriage finally collapsed. Joyce left with Jeffrey's younger brother, David, while Lionel busied himself elsewhere, leaving Jeffrey, still a teenager, practically alone in the family house. This sudden vacuum provided the perfect environment for the unthinkable to take its first step into reality. The first kill. A door opens. It was the summer of 1978, and Jeffrey Dahmer was 18 years old. He had just graduated from high school with little fanfare. The house on West Bath Road was silent, no parents around, no watchful eyes. This lonely setting proved fertile ground for the darkest seeds in Jeffrey's psyche to grow. Around June, Dahmer picked up a hitchhiker named Stephen Mark Hicks, offering him a ride under the pretense of enjoying a few drinks and music. Hicks accepted, unsuspecting that his life was teetering on the edge of destruction. At the Dahmer house, the pair spent some hours drinking, perhaps chatting about music or mundane topics. But when Hicks decided it was time to leave, Jeffrey panicked. He dreaded being alone as something in him snapped. Grabbing a barbell, he struck Hicks on the head, then strangled him to death. Realizing the gravity of what he had done, Dahmer found himself paradoxically shaken, yet also enthralled by this horrific first kill. Any notions of moral or empathetic revulsion were overshadowed by an intense curiosity. In the days following the murder, Dahmer dismembered Hicks' body, carefully dissecting it much as he had once dissected small animals. He eventually dissolved portions of flesh in acid, pulverized the bones, and scattered the remains in the woods behind the house. The entire ordeal exposed him to a dangerous sense of power, a twisted satisfaction in controlling another's fate from start to finish. It is here, in the darkest bowels of Bath Township, that Jeffrey Dahmer committed the inaugural crime in a series of murders that would span over a decade. Remarkably, no immediate suspicion fell upon him. Stephen Hicks was merely reported missing, another young adult who might have run off to see the world, authorities assumed. The patchwork nature of law enforcement at the time, combined with Hicks' background, meant that few connected the dots to the quiet teen in the neighborhood. And so Dahmer's secret remained his alone. This crime represented a fundamental turning point. Dahmer could have felt overwhelming guilt or terror. Instead, the feelings that emerged were more akin to anxiety about being caught, coexisting with a perverse thrill that demanded repetition. Before long, he would embark on a path that would see the boundaries of his depravity expand with each new kill. From Ohio to the Army, temporary respite. In the aftermath of his first murder, Dahmer made a half-hearted attempt at college life, enrolling at Ohio State University. Unsurprisingly, he fared poorly, primarily due to binge drinking and a glaring lack of motivation. Lionel Dahmer, exasperated by his son's downward spiral, pushed him toward a more disciplined environment. As a result, Jeffrey enlisted in the U.S. Army in early 1979, perhaps hoping that structure and distance might tame his demons. He was trained as a combat medic and stationed in Germany. For a time, this shift seemed to stabilize his life. The regimentation of military service left limited space for the chaotic habits that had consumed him in Ohio. However, it did not erase the internal urges that haunted him. Anecdotal reports suggest that during his service, Dahmer was implicated in sexually violent behavior, though these incidents remain partly unsubstantiated or lightly documented. By 1981, his alcohol abuse and troubling conduct caught up with him, culminating in his discharge from the Army. The official reason was related to his drinking problem, but darker rumors trailed him. He returned to the United States, drifting from one relative's house to another, occasionally in trouble with the law for minor offenses, disorderly conduct, indecent exposure, yet never drawing attention as a suspect in a homicide. One might ponder why he did not kill again during these Army years. Perhaps the structured environment stifled his opportunities. Or maybe he was too watchful of potential exposure. Regardless, upon returning to civilian life, the thirst for control, for that vile sense of power he had tasted, simmered in the background, awaiting a new trigger. Prelude to more horrors. Life with grandmother. Upon returning to Milwaukee, Jeffrey took refuge in his devoutly religious grandmother's home in West Allis, a quiet suburb not far from downtown. Catherine Dahmer was patient and caring. She hoped to guide Jeffrey away from alcohol and wayward behavior. For a brief period, it seemed her warmth might soothe his troubled mind. He attended church, pitched in with household chores, and even secured work at a local chocolate factory. Yet, darkness found cracks to seep through. At night, Dahmer cruised gay bars in the city's nightlife districts. It was the 1980s, a time when the LGBTQ+ community faced significant societal stigma and lacked many legal protections. Dahmer discovered that some men on the scene, marginalized and often juggling precarious finances or housing situations, could be approached with offers of cash in return for photography sessions or sexual favors. Now, some of these encounters were consensual, but the fantasies swirling in Jeffrey's mind extended far beyond that. In 1982, he was arrested for indecent exposure at a state fair, a minor charge that did not hint at the depth of his depravity. Later, he drugged men he met in bathhouses, seeking to keep them unconscious during sexual activity, a shocking violation that eventually got him banned from several establishments. Despite such red flags, no thorough investigation connected these offenses to potential homicide. Catherine Dahmer observed unusual behavior, a persistent smell in her basement, odd hours her grandson kept, and the occasional disturbing item in the garbage. Yet each time she confronted him, Jeffrey dismissed her concerns with excuses. A rotting animal, maybe, or leftover chemicals from a job. She lacked the capacity to imagine that her grandson was on the brink of spree killings. Eventually, tension arose when Catherine objected to Jeffrey bringing men into her home. By 1988, the arrangement had grown untenable. After a conviction for drugging and molesting a minor, the sibling of a future murder victim, it was evident that her home was no place for him. Jeffrey Dahmer needed his own apartment, a private domain where the darkest corners of his psyche could thrive without intrusion. New digs, renewed darkness. In 1989, Jeffrey Dahmer secured a small apartment, initially near 24th Street, later moving to the now infamous Oxford Apartments on North 25th Street. This step represented more than a change of address. It was a gateway to an environment perfectly suited for his crimes. Living alone, paying rent from his meager earnings at the chocolate factory or subsequent jobs, Dahmer slowly but steadily escalated his search for victims. The pattern was straightforward: but deeply unnerving. Dahmer often approached men in bars, at bus stops, or sometimes on the street. He leveraged his mild demeanor and unthreatening aura, offering cash for photography or companionship. Victims would come willingly, lured by the promise of easy money, a few drinks, or a party. Upon arriving at the apartment, a cramped, sparsely decorated space, they would be offered alcohol spiked with potent sedatives. Once unconscious, these men were at Dahmer's mercy. By 1990 and 1991, the frequency of these murders accelerated alarmingly. Each new victim faced similar horrors: strangulation, dismemberment, and, in especially grotesque instances, cannibalism. Dahmer methodically kept body parts, heads, limbs, organs in his refrigerator or freezer. Photographs documented the stages of dismemberment. Some skeletal remains he attempted to preserve with bleaching agents or acid, while others were dissolved in vats of corrosive solutions. The stench of decay permeated the apartment, seeping into hallways and sparking complaints from neighbors. The trophies. Central to Dahmer's evolving ritual was an urge to keep trophies. He believed that retaining pieces of his victims, whether Polaroids or actual body parts, granted him ongoing control and companionship. The bloody refrigerator file, as police would later call it, referred not only to the horrific photographic evidence, but also to the literal storage of certain remains in the fridge or freezer. This horrifying practice was in line with Dahmer's twisted desire for intimacy that transcended mortality. No matter how depraved or impossible it was to achieve genuine human closeness. Close calls. Astonishingly, Dahmer's spree nearly got exposed multiple times. Disturbances at the Oxford apartments led to calls for law enforcement, with neighbors complaining of screams or foul odors. Yet whenever police arrived, Dahmer calmly recited a story: rotting meat, a broken freezer, or a lover's quarrel. The subtle biases of the time, homophobia, racism, and assumptions about domestic disputes resulted in missed opportunities to uncover the truth. In the most notorious instance, a 14-year-old boy, Connor Synthesumphone, escaped Dahmer's clutches only to be returned to him by responding officers who accepted Dahmer's explanation that this was a spat between adult partners. Connor was murdered that same night. Escalation. Over time, Dahmer's desire for total control reached grotesque extremes. In some experiments, he drilled holes into victims' skulls, injecting acids or boiling water in an attempt to create a living, zombified sex slave. None of these attempts succeeded, resulting only in lethal agony for the victims. If any shred of empathy might have halted him, it was overshadowed by an overpowering compulsion. Each death, each dismemberment, seemed to reinforce a spiral of isolation and depravity, forging his place among history's most chilling serial killers. The fateful night, July 22, 1991. It was a sweltering Monday evening in Milwaukee. In the dim corridors of the Oxford apartments, neighbors settled in for the night. Some turned up the volume of their televisions to drown out the rancid smells and sporadic sounds emanating from Unit 213. Meanwhile, Jeffrey Dahmer led a potential victim, Tracy Edwards, into his lair, expecting to repeat his pattern of seduction, drugging, and killing. Yet, fate intervened. As Dahmer brandished a knife, Edwards, who had only been partially drugged, fought back. Adrenaline surged, granting him clarity. He managed to flee the apartment, still partially bound by handcuffs, and flagged down a police patrol car near 25th Street. Edwards breathlessly recounted an encounter with a crazy man who had tried to kill him. Initially skeptical, officers Robert Roth and Rolf Mueller decided to investigate. Upon entering Dahmer's apartment, they immediately sensed the rank odor, something metallic, decaying. Dahmer attempted his usual calm approach, explaining Edwards had been a guest, that there was a misunderstanding. But the officers, noticing suspicious Polaroids scattered on a dresser, realized these pictures showed men in disturbing, dismembered poses, apparently taken within that very apartment. In a pivotal moment, Officer Mueller opened the refrigerator. Inside, on the lower shelf, was a freshly severed human head. Shock and revulsion rippled through the room. Additional searches uncovered multiple skulls, human remains in a barrel of acid, severed limbs in the freezer, and countless photographs capturing the horrors. With nowhere left to hide, Dahmer reportedly murmured some version of "in caught" before submitting to arrest. Outside, neighbors gathered, wondering about the flashing lights and the flurry of commotion. Soon, the ghastly truth spread. Jeffrey Dahmer was a serial killer, and his modest apartment was a chamber of unimaginable atrocities. Immediate aftermath, Milwaukee in shock word spread like wildfire through local and national media. House of Horrors discovered in Milwaukee, headlines screamed. People who had known Dahmer in passing found themselves reeling in disbelief. Former co-workers at the chocolate factory described him as a bit odd, but not threatening. Neighbors expressed regret and horror that they had never pressed the police harder about the stench and unusual activity. Families of missing men, particularly from the city's marginalized communities, held their breath, fearing the worst about their loved ones. Law enforcement launched a massive investigative effort, cataloging every item in Dahmer's apartment. Over 70 Polaroid pictures were taken into evidence, forming the skeleton of the bloody refrigerator file. Forensic pathologists worked meticulously to match dismembered remains with identities. The final victim count would eventually be placed at 17, though early rumors suggested even more. The scale of the carnage was nearly unparalleled in modern American crime, leaving authorities grappling with how one individual could inflict so much horror without detection. Local leaders tried to calm an anxious populace. Community meetings convened to discuss how the system had failed. A swirl of anger targeted the police department for returning Connerex synthesis phone to Dahmer's custody, despite the boy's obvious distress. Activists decried underlying homophobia and racism, which they believed contributed to ignoring repeated complaints. Milwaukee was forced to confront an uncomfortable reality. The same social fractures that had let a serial killer operate so brazenly needed urgent repair. Against this tumultuous backdrop, Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer sat in an interrogation room, quietly confessing to a litany of crime, so heinous they seemed ripped from the darkest corners of fiction. Over the next weeks, the world would watch as the case unfolded, culminating in a courtroom drama that aimed to unravel the mind of one of history's most infamous murderers. Digging for answers, the interrogations in the days following Dahmer's arrest, detectives spent countless hours questioning him, seeking clarity on each victim's fate and how he had perpetrated such atrocities under the radar. Unexpectedly cooperative, Dahmer recounted his crimes in a dispassionate, eerily calm manner. It was as though, having been caught, he no longer felt compelled to hide the details. Indeed, some suggested he was almost relieved to finally share his twisted secrets. During these sessions, Dahmer's thought processes emerged with stark clarity. He claimed he did not kill out of hatred or sadism per se, but out of a twisted desire for companionship so complete that he believed killing was the only way to keep someone near him forever. He described the sense of power he felt after that first murder, how it lingered in his psyche, urging him to relive it. His attempts at creating zombies by injecting acid or boiling water into victims' skulls were, by his own account, a misguided effort to erase his crippling fear of abandonment. Though detectives found his statements chilling, they also found them bizarrely consistent with the evidence. Each victim's story, piece by piece, corroborated Dahmer's confessions. The bars where he met them, the lures he used, the methods of killing, and the ways he stored or disposed of their remains. His recollections were almost clinical, lacking the emotional nuance one might expect from someone describing murder. Yet occasional flickers of what seemed like regret broke through his otherwise stoic demeanor, leaving investigators to ponder whether any genuine remorse existed beneath the monstrous facade. These confessions formed the prosecutorial bedrock against him. Every detail, every horrifying step was logged into a file that prosecutors would brandish in the upcoming trial. As the story spilled into the media, people around the globe struggled to fathom how an unassuming man with a gentle voice and a hint of awkwardness could commit acts that pushed the boundaries of human comprehension. In the swirl of tabloid sensationalism, the term "the bloody refrigerator file" dominated front pages. Derived from the literal photographs and body parts found in Dahmer's fridge, it summed up the macabre heart of the case. Late-night talk shows and primetime news alike dissected the revelations. Experts debated how society and law enforcement had failed. Milwaukee, once overshadowed by bigger cities, became the center of a cautionary tale about complacency, prejudice, and moral blind spots. Prelude to a trial, legal maneuvers, charged with multiple counts of first-degree murder, Dahmer was moved to a secure county jail to await trial. His court-appointed defense team found themselves in an unprecedented position. Their client had essentially confessed to everything in painstaking detail. The question wasn't whether he was guilty, but whether he could mount an insanity defense. From the prosecution's standpoint, the case was open and shut. They had physical evidence, videotaped confessions, and surviving witnesses like Tracy Edwards. The biggest concern was ensuring that no legal technicalities or mishandling of evidence could sabotage the verdict. Meanwhile, victims' families anxiously watched, craving justice, but dreading the emotional toll of a trial that would force them to relive their loved ones' final moments. Within the general public, fear mingled with a grim curiosity. Bookstores sold out of true crime tomes. Television crews lingered outside the courthouse, interviewing anyone with tangential knowledge of Dahmer. Public debate flared about how to handle criminals of this magnitude. Some advocated for the death penalty, though Wisconsin had outlawed capital punishment. Others argued that the real question revolved around mental health failings and whether someone so obviously disturbed might have been identified earlier. These dialogues underscored a broader social introspection. If men could vanish for months without thorough investigations, if the disturbing behavior of a neighbor could be repeatedly overlooked, if systemic biases allowed violent predators to slip through cracks, then the issue went beyond one serial killer. It implicated the city, the police, and the culture at large. Amid this swirl, Dahmer remained mostly silent. He spent hours in his cell, rarely engaging with other inmates. Reports suggest he occasionally read the Bible, at other times doodling or writing. Journalists clamored for interviews, but he granted few. When he did speak to the press, his demeanor reflected a subdued acceptance, as though he understood the monstrous image the world had of him and felt powerless to change it. Into the courtroom. The trial begins when the date for Jeffrey Dahmer's trial arrived. Milwaukee was awash with tension and sorrow. A city that once prided itself on its Midwestern neighborliness now found itself under the unrelenting glare of media spotlights. News vans lined the streets near the county courthouse, their satellite dishes aimed skyward. Spectators from across the country, and indeed the world, waited to see whether the judicial process could bring closure to the harrowing chapter that had claimed at least 17 lives. A somber assembly victims' families, wearing solemn expressions, filled the public seating area. Some clutched photographs of their loved ones, others held hands in tense silence. Many had lived through months, sometimes years, of uncertainty, praying that their missing relatives might one day return alive. Now they confronted the man who had unceremoniously torn those hopes away. Journalists busily took notes, their cameras capturing every subtle shift in Dahmer's posture. In this environment, laden with emotional charge, it was easy to forget that a formal trial has its own rhythms and procedures, rules designed to ensure justice is served, however unbearable the underlying facts may be. The charges prosecutors had filed 15 counts of first-degree murder, omitting 2 murders that occurred in Ohio, primarily for jurisdictional reasons. The central evidence was powerful: Dahmer's extensive confession, the grisly photos, dismembered remains, and witness testimonies. There was little doubt as to who committed the murders. The central question was how the legal system would navigate the possibility of an insanity defense. Entering not guilty by reason of insanity, led by his defense attorneys, Dahmer entered a plea of not guilty by reason of mental disease or defect for each murder charge. In other words, they did not dispute he had killed these men. They argued that his capacity to distinguish right from wrong was so diminished by psychological abnormality that he should not be held criminally responsible. To some onlookers, this seemed an affront, a maneuver to avoid accountability for unthinkable acts. Yet the insanity defense is a recognized legal strategy, albeit successful in only a minuscule fraction of cases. In Wisconsin, to prove this defense, the defense team needed to show that Dahmer either did not understand the criminality of his actions or lacked the capacity to conform his conduct to the requirements of the law at the time of the offenses. Courtroom dynamics: Judge Lawrence Graham, Jr. presided. The prosecution, led by Michael McCann, meticulously framed Dahmer's actions as methodical and planned. Each murder involved selection of a victim, luring the individual to Dahmer's residence, and elaborate means of disposal or trophy keeping. The argument was that such behaviors demonstrated a clear understanding of criminal wrongdoing and an ability to hide evidence, revealing not madness, but cold deliberation. Meanwhile, defense counsel Gerald Boyle offered an alternative interpretation that the grotesque nature of Dahmer's crimes underscored severe mental illness. Boyle pointed to Dahmer's repeated attempts to create a zombie-like companion through drilling and injecting acidic substances. Could such bizarre experiments be the product of a sane mind, or did they hint at psychosis? Moreover, the defense emphasized Dahmer's desire to keep victims with him forever, claiming that an ordinary murderer seeking mere profit or thrill would not go to such bizarre lengths. Witnesses and evidence. Piecing together the horror, the prosecution began by laying a foundation of undisputed facts. Police detectives took the stand to narrate their nightmarish discovery at Dahmer's apartment on July 22, 1991. Testimony included descriptions of the rancid odor of decomposition, the Polaroid photos depicting dismemberment, and the severed heads and torsos stored in various states. Prosecutors presented each piece of physical evidence with clinical detail: bags of tools, the vat of acid, remains of clothing identified as belonging to different victims. While such direct evidence was overwhelming, it needed to be recounted carefully for the jury, so that no procedural misstep would open the door to an appeal. Emotional testimonies: family members of victims testified about their loved ones' last sightings. Some had known about the men's plan to meet a new friend, only to vanish without explanation. The raw emotion in their voices underscored the weight of the tragedy. Tearful descriptions of phone calls unreturned, missing person reports filed with little follow-up, and the eventual horror of learning a son, a brother, or a best friend had ended up in Dahmer's freezer. Beyond the heartbreak, these testimonies served an evidentiary purpose: to link each victim to the times and places Dahmer had operated. A cousin might recall that the victim left the house to go downtown on a particular Friday night. Phone records might show a final call to Dahmer's apartment. Over time, the puzzle formed a single dark tapestry, tying the murders explicitly back to Dahmer's location and timeline. Tracy Edwards on the stand. A pivotal witness was Tracy Edwards, the man whose harrowing escape led to the discovery of Dahmer's crimes. Taking the stand, Edwards recounted the terrifying experience, arriving at Dahmer's apartment under the premise of earning money, noticing the foul odor, and then being trapped at knife point. His testimony painted a vivid picture of Dahmer's unpredictability, calm and manipulative one moment, menacing and violent the next. Edwards described how he managed to flee, half-handcuffed, encountering the police, who initially doubted his story, but eventually followed him back to apartment 213. Through his words, jurors could picture the horrifying final moments many victims must have faced before losing consciousness. Investigative details the trial also showcased the systematic work of forensic examiners. They explained the matching of body parts to each victim via dental records, DNA analysis, or distinctive personal artifacts found in Dahmer's lair. Specialists in toxicology discussed the sedatives discovered in victims' systems. Crime scene analysts meticulously traced how Dahmer utilized chemicals, bleach, acid, and other corrosive substances to remove flesh from bone. Every detail underscored a chilling, methodical approach that, to the prosecution, indicated sanity rather than insanity. Over the course of the presentation, the jury's faces often registered shock, revulsion, and sorrow. This was no typical homicide trial. It was a relentless barrage of the macabre. Yet they had a civic duty to remain impartial and evaluate whether Dahmer was truly legally insane or simply driven by monstrous compulsions that fell within the realm of criminal responsibility. The defense's case, insanity or evil? Following the prosecution's onslaught of forensic evidence and witness testimony, it was the defense team's turn to humanize their client, or at least to explain how he could commit such atrocities in a psychologically disordered state. Psychiatric experts, prominent psychiatrists, took the stand to argue that Dahmer suffered from a mental disease, a severe necrophilia intertwined with borderline psychosis. One expert described Dahmer's inability to form normal attachments, his persistent fantasies about possessing others, and his attempts to turn those fantasies into reality via zombie making. Another pointed to an extensive history of alcohol abuse, exacerbating existing mental health issues. Crucially, the defense experts aimed to distinguish rational cunning from moral or psychological comprehension. The planning required to hide evidence might not necessarily equate to a true appreciation of right and wrong. They contended if Dahmer's mental distortions drove him to perceive his victims more as objects than human beings. They highlighted the repeated failure of his experiments to yield any outcome but death, suggesting he was operating under bizarre delusions about controlling or enslaving another person. Cross-examination prosecutors cross-examined these mental health professionals with pointed questions. If Dahmer was so divorced from reality, why did he take elaborate steps to avoid detection? Why did he lie to neighbors about the smell or lock his bedroom door when visitors arrived? Were these actions not evidence of a man who fully grasped the illegality of his deeds? The exchange occasionally grew tense as medical jargon clashed with legal definitions, leaving the jury to untangle a labyrinth of technicalities. Dahmer's potential remorse in an unusual move, the defense considered having Dahmer speak about his regrets. While he did not formally take the stand in front of the jury, he conveyed to psychiatrists his anguish at having been unable to stop, expressing a desire for the death penalty in a state that did not have capital punishment. Whether these sentiments were genuine or performative remained debatable, but they offered a glimpse of an internal torment inconsistent with someone purely manipulative. Some observers insisted it was a ploy. Others thought it revealed a fractured psyche overwhelmed by deviant obsession. Public opinion outside the courtroom, a swirling tide of editorial pieces, talk radio segments, and coffee shop discussions dissected the insanity defense. Many Milwaukeeans believed that calling Dahmer insane was an understatement, but not a sufficient legal justification to exempt him from punishment. "You can be sick and still be evil," one local man told a reporter. The community had become a reluctant expert on legal definitions of insanity, morality, and accountability, each day learning more about the chilling possibilities of the human psyche. Closing arguments. Defining responsibility. After weeks of exhaustive testimony and emotional highs and lows, the trial approached its culmination. Both sides prepared statements that would shape the jury's final deliberations. Prosecution's finale lead prosecutor Michael McCann organized a clear timeline from Dahmer's first murder of Stephen Hicks in 1978 to the final near victim Tracy Edwards in 1991. He highlighted each step of planning, each instance of covering tracks, each lie to police and neighbors. This meticulous approach, he argued, was the sign of someone who recognized the wrongfulness of his actions, but persisted anyway. Someone monstrous, yes, but not exempt from the law. McCann invoked the pain of the victims' families, the terror of the community, and the moral imperative of holding Dahmer fully accountable. "This is not madness," he concluded. "This is murder in its most deliberate form." Defense's last stand, Gerald Boyle, for the defense, turned to the disturbing details of cannibalism and the so-called zombie experiments, emphasizing their irrational, repugnant nature. If Dahmer had been in rational control of himself, he argued, no sane logic would lead him to store heads in a refrigerator or attempt chemical lobotomies. The defense stressed that while Dahmer may have known his actions were illegal, his mental disorder was so severe that it rendered him incapable of conforming to societal expectations. "He is profoundly ill," Boyle intoned, "and punishing him like a rational criminal does not address the depth of that illness." Jury's burden. The tension in the courtroom was tangible as the jury retreated to deliberate. An entire city, and indeed the nation, held its collective breath. Would they classify Dahmer as insane, placing him in a psychiatric institution? Or would they find him sane and thus fully culpable, sentencing him to life behind bars, Wisconsin having abolished the death penalty in 1853? Media analysts, perched outside, offered non-stop coverage. Psychologists debated the nuances of paraphilic disorders. Religious groups prayed for the victims, while others prayed for Dahmer's soul. Taxi drivers, bartenders, and retirees all had opinions. Some passionately insisted this was pure evil, not mental illness. Others felt that only an unimaginably warped mind could commit such acts. The verdict and sentencing on February 15, 1992. The jury delivered its decision after approximately 5 hours of deliberation. They rejected Dahmer's insanity plea, finding him legally sane and guilty on 15 counts of first-degree murder. The announcement was met with a hush, then a flurry of emotion. Some family members wept in relief, while others let out quiet sobs of grief and exhaustion. Dahmer stood expressionless, his eyes lowered. The weight of finality had descended. Formal sentencing the following day, Judge Lawrence Graham Jr. pronounced Dahmer's sentence. For each murder count, Dahmer received a mandatory life term. In total, he faced 15 consecutive life sentences, totaling 957 years in prison. Because Wisconsin had no capital punishment, the life term was the maximum penalty. Addressing Dahmer, the judge spoke of the unfathomable pain inflicted upon victims and families, condemning him to spend the rest of his life behind bars with no prospect of release. At the sentencing hearing, some victims' relatives exercised their right to address Dahmer. Their statements ranged from heartbreak to fury. One sister of a victim unleashed her rage, screaming through tears that she hoped he would rot in hell. Another family member calmly recounted the bright future his lost loved one had once envisioned. Through it all, Dahmer remained silent, except for occasional murmured apologies, acknowledging the enormity of his crimes, yet not excusing them. Public response outside the courthouse, a surreal mixture of closure and continued horror, hung in the air. The Milwaukee Journal ran the headline, "Dahmer guilty, judge imposes 957 years." Citizens exhaled in relief, knowing the killer would never walk free, but the anguish left behind could never be fully remedied. Weeks later, a separate trial in Ohio for the murder of Stephen Hicks ended similarly with another life sentence. Yet it hardly affected Dahmer's final status, given the sheer weight of his Wisconsin convictions. The broader social conversation also persisted. Critics charged that systemic failures and biases allowed Dahmer to remain unnoticed for too long. Some police officials resigned or faced disciplinary actions, particularly those involved in the Conoric Synthesome phone incident. Advocacy groups demanded reforms in handling missing person cases, especially for LGBTQ+ individuals and people of color. The city recognized that while Dahmer alone was responsible for his atrocities, multiple layers of institutional complacency had inadvertently aided his spree. Behind bars, a killer's life in prison. With the final gavel struck, Jeffrey Dahmer became inmate at 177,252 at the Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin. Although he had escaped the death penalty, by virtue of it not existing in that state, life on the inside carried its own perils for someone so reviled by society. An isolated existence initially, Dahmer was placed in protective custody. Not only was he a high-profile inmate, but the gruesome nature of his crimes, particularly cannibalism and the victimization of young men, made him a prime target for violence from other prisoners. Corrections officers had to weigh the risk that fellow inmates might seek retribution. Dahmer spent substantial time in solitary confinement or under close supervision, cut off from communal activities, except for heavily monitored sessions, such as supervised chapel visits. Dahmer's daily routine was stripped to the basics: waking, meals, short exercises, then back to a cramped cell. Prison staff noted that he spent hours reading detective novels, the Bible, occasionally science magazines. He rarely socialized, though eventually he found limited acquaintances who would share a table or chat briefly. Religious turn. One unexpected development was Dahmer's turn toward religion. He began corresponding with a minister who visited him regularly. Reports emerged that Dahmer underwent a Christian baptism in prison, claiming he sought forgiveness and spiritual redemption. Outside observers were divided. Some considered it a cynical ploy, others saw it as a man trying to come to terms with the enormity of his crimes. Certain victim families dismissed his religious overtures as too little, too late. Still, Dahmer continued reading scripture, discussing theology with prison chaplains, and maintaining a humble, subdued demeanor. Family visits. Lionel Dahmer, Jeffrey's father, remained a conflicted yet supportive presence. He came to see his son in prison, grappling with profound guilt and sorrow. Over time, Lionel wrote a book discussing Jeffrey's upbringing, their family dynamic, and his own remorse for not recognizing the warning signs earlier. The father's sense of heartbreak was palpable, while the mother, Joyce, had her own emotional burdens, rarely speaking publicly. The entire extended family lived under a cloud of confusion, condemnation, and pity, forever tied to the monstrous reputation of one member. Threats and tensions. Despite all precautions, prisons are violent microcosms of society, fraught with tensions and unspoken hierarchies. Child molesters and those who kill children or engaged in cannibalism often become prime targets for inmate aggression. Rumors circulated that many prisoners yearned for an opportunity to harm Dahmer, viewing him as the lowest of the low. Although prison staff tried to prevent violence, the environment remained precarious. Eventually, Dahmer was allowed certain privileges, including work assignments and periods of minimal supervision, a decision that would prove fateful. The final bloodshed. Dahmer's death. On the morning of November 28, 1994, Jeffrey Dahmer was assigned to a work detail alongside two other inmates, Jesse Anderson and Christopher Scarver. They were left unguarded for a short period while cleaning toilets in the prison gym's locker room area, an administrative oversight or a lapse in protocol that remains controversial. The attacked Christopher Scarver, incarcerated for a separate murder, had long harbored animosity toward Dahmer. He would later claim that Dahmer's crimes, particularly involving cannibalism, deeply disturbed him, and that Dahmer had engaged in provocative behavior in prison, allegedly shaping food into body part forms to taunt others. Whether these claims were fully accurate remains uncertain, but tensions clearly ran high. Seizing the moment, Scarver grabbed a metal bar from nearby equipment. He brutally bludgeoned Dahmer, striking him repeatedly in the head. He similarly attacked Jesse Anderson, leaving both men gravely wounded. By the time guards intervened, Dahmer lay on the floor, blood pooling around his fractured skull. Rushed to a hospital, he was pronounced dead shortly after. He was 34 years old, having served just over 2 years of his multiple life sentences. Reaction's news of Dahmer's death ignited a fresh wave of media frenzy. Some of the victims' families expressed a grim sense of relief or closure, stating they felt a burden lifted knowing he no longer existed. Others believed that death was too quick, denying them the satisfaction of seeing him live out a lengthy punishment behind bars. Still others, including Lionel Dahmer, mourn in a more complicated way, acknowledging the horrendous crimes, yet lamenting the violent end of a life that had once been an innocent child. Within the prison system, an investigation followed, though results were inconclusive. Rumors suggested guards may have deliberately left Dahmer vulnerable, recognizing how hated he was among inmates. Official statements denied any conspiracy, chalking it up to a tragic lapse in protocol. Regardless, the net effect was an abrupt end to the life of one of America's most notorious serial killers. Legacy in death following Dahmer's demise, the question of what to do with his remains or any personal belongings sparked debate. Some argued that no funeral should be held, that his body should be cast aside unceremoniously. Others believed that even a criminal as reviled as Dahmer deserved basic human rights. In the end, his remains were cremated. The brain, interestingly, was kept for a time at the request of Joyce Dahmer, who wanted it studied for potential neurological anomalies. Ultimately, after a legal dispute with Lionel, the brain was also destroyed. And thus ended the life of Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer, one of the modern era's most horrifying figures. His existence had spanned only 3.5 decades, yet in that period, he managed to commit acts that would scar dozens of families, traumatize a city, and challenge the public's understanding of evil, sanity, and redemption. Reflections on the system. Could it have been stopped? In the wake of Dahmer's arrest and subsequent death, Milwaukee and the broader United States engaged in a round of soul-searching. The case exposed glaring weaknesses in law enforcement procedures, particularly regarding missing persons investigations. It also spotlighted systemic issues like homophobia and racism. Dahmer often targeted men who were gay, men of color, or men living on society's fringes, individuals less likely to be immediately missed or vigorously searched for. Police failures. The most infamous lapse was returning Conneric's synthesin phone to Dahmer after the boy had escaped, drugged and bleeding, into the street. The officers on scene believed Dahmer's story that it was a domestic quarrel. Investigations revealed deeply ingrained biases. Officers were sometimes disinclined to investigate complaints involving homosexual relationships or people of color with the same urgency afforded to others. Public uproar led to disciplinary measures, but the damage was irreversible. Multiple more victims would be killed after that night. Community apathy or fear. Neighbors' testimonies illustrated a climate of silence. Some smelled the decay or heard screams, but felt too intimidated or embarrassed to press the issue. In a time of high crime, many believed the police wouldn't respond effectively, especially in neighborhoods perceived as lower priority. A few individuals did call law enforcement, but repeated dismissals or mild investigations reinforced the sense of futility. The Dahmer case sparked renewed calls for community policing, urging officers to build rapport in marginalized areas and respond thoroughly to repeated complaints. Mental health gaps. Dahmer's repeated brushes with mental health professionals from his teenage years through adulthood also revealed deficits in how potential offenders are identified. He had exhibited necrophilic obsessions, alcohol abuse, and paraphilic fantasies, yet the deeper underpinnings remained unaddressed. Some blamed the overburdened mental health system, while others pointed to stigma around homosexuality and deviance that discouraged frank discussion of one's darkest impulses. Could earlier intervention have deterred him? Or were his violent drives so ingrained that no therapy would suffice? Calls for reform. While no single policy could guarantee prevention of another Dahmer, a chorus of reforms emerged. Stronger missing persons protocols, mandating immediate investigations when someone vanishes under suspicious circumstances, regardless of age, lifestyle, or background. Cultural competency training, educating law enforcement on recognizing and overcoming biases related to race, sexuality, and socioeconomic status. Enhanced mental health resources, bolstering public mental health services to identify severe paraphilias or harmful obsessions earlier, possibly through mandatory evaluations for repeated sexual offenses. Community vigilance, empowering residents to report suspicious activities without fear of dismissal, encouraging consistent follow-ups by authorities. It was too late for Dahmer's victims, but these conversations aimed to reduce future tragedies. While many new measures were adopted, the scope of changes varied regionally, and critics argued that American society remains vulnerable to predatory individuals in hidden niches. Impact on the victims. Families. No story of a serial killer is complete without acknowledging those left behind. The mothers, fathers, siblings, and friends forced to continue living in an agonizing void. For them, the revelations of what happened inside Dahmer's apartment inflicted trauma that lingered for decades. A haunting knowledge. Unlike certain murder cases, where a missing body remains an abstraction, Dahmer's victims were often identified through harrowingly graphic evidence. Families could not cling to the comfort of imagining a peaceful passing. They knew precisely how their loved ones had suffered. Many experienced nightmares and flashbacks, especially those who witnessed the trial, the photographs, or the descriptions of cannibalism. Grief counselors worked overtime, but the intensity of this loss was overwhelming. Confronting the killer, a few family members came face to face with Dahmer in court, directing righteous anger at the man who had stolen a piece of their world. Their impact statements, raw and tearful, remain some of the most poignant in true crime history, highlighting the monstrous gap between his mild demeanor and the savagery of his actions. Some demanded the death penalty, others believed a lifetime in prison was a more fitting punishment. Long-term healing in the aftermath. Some families turned to advocacy. They formed support groups, lobbied for policy changes, and gave interviews in hopes of raising awareness about runaways, missing LGBTQ+ individuals, or the need for better policing. Still, not all found closure. A handful withdrew from public life, struggling to piece together their mental health after such a traumatic revelation. Generational trauma often took hold, altering family structures for years to come. Despite varied paths, each bore the scars of Dahmer's crimes, a daily confrontation with the darkest side of humanity. They remain the silent witnesses to a horror that, for them, never fully fades. Society's morbid fascination. Serial killers, especially those as extreme as Dahmer, often become subjects of macabre intrigue. True crime fans, armchair detectives, and rubbernecking onlookers pore over every known detail. Books and documentaries abound, analyzing the psychology of the killer, the failings of the system, and the heartbreak of the victims. Though many such works are sober in tone, aiming to educate, some veer toward lurid sensationalism, an ethical tightrope when dealing with real victims' pain. Commercial exploitation in the years after Dahmer's arrest, souvenirs related to him, letters he wrote in prison, sketches, even small personal effects, occasionally surfaced on murderabilia websites. Morbid collectors shelled out surprising sums to own a fragment of this dark piece of history. Families of victims, appalled, campaigned to ban the sale of such artifacts, labeling it a grotesque profiteering from tragedy. Some states passed laws restricting the sale of notorious criminal memorabilia, though online markets proved difficult to regulate. Media portrayals, television networks aired interviews with investigators, as well as docu-dramas reenacting the arrest. Journalists dissected the inexplicable evil angle, sometimes stumbling into sensational lines about the butcher of Milwaukee. More nuanced works emerged, too, exploring the intersection of mental health, sexuality, and policing failures. Over time, academic conferences studied Dahmer's case in relation to antisocial personality disorders, extreme paraphilias, and the phenomenon of necrophilia. Ethical dilemmas, this swirling attention ignited debates about the fine line between awareness and exploitation. On one hand, confronting such disturbing cases can spur social reflection and policy reform. On the other, repeated dramatizations risk overshadowing the victim's humanity, reducing them to gruesome anecdotes in a killer's narrative. As the years passed, certain creators made efforts to center survivors' voices, highlighting the irreversible impact on families and the communal call for vigilance in protecting vulnerable populations. Whether society's enduring fascination arises from a desire to understand deviance or from darker voyeuristic impulses, the Dahmer case stands as a prime example of how the public can both recoil from and obsess over unimaginable horror. The Bloody Refrigerator File. Symbol of a nightmare, the phrase, "the bloody refrigerator file," remains a shorthand for the cruelest, most visceral elements of Dahmer's crimes. It references the literal images found in his apartment, documenting his victims' dismembered bodies, as well as the actual body parts kept chilled among everyday items. For the police who first witnessed it, the horror was indelible. For forensic examiners, it became a case study in how some criminals meticulously record their atrocities. Why the obsession with documentation? Criminal profilers suggest Dahmer's photography and trophy-keeping sprang from a deep-rooted need to relive the kill. Once his victim was gone, he faced the return of the loneliness and emptiness he tried so desperately to stave off. By preserving body parts and capturing Polaroids, Dahmer ensured a twisted form of perpetual company. It also provided a sense of control and dominion. He could revisit those moments at will, reaffirming his dark fantasies even when no new victim was present. Societal reaction. When the Bloody Refrigerator File detail was broadcast, the public's shock escalated. If murder alone was appalling, the notion of a fridge turned into a morgue crossed a boundary that left many numb. The outcry went beyond typical condemnation of a serial killer. It felt like a violation of ordinary domestic life. A refrigerator is a symbol of nourishment, familial comfort, and normalcy. Dahmer's twisted usage exemplified an utter inversion of cherished routines. Tabloids capitalized on the shock value, plastering "bloody refrigerator" across front pages. Talk shows debated whether media coverage was fueling a copycat risk. Psychologists interviewed on these programs drew parallels with other murderers who kept trophies, but none had quite the same chilling flair for everyday household items repurposed in vile ways. The public's revulsion at this imagery contributed to Dahmer's lasting place in criminal lore. An unsettling legacy over time, references to the bloody refrigerator file acquired almost mythical resonance. It epitomizes the extreme lengths a killer can go to indulge impulses while blending into the daily rhythms of city life. For criminologists, it remains a case pointing to the complexities of paraphilic disorders, the significance of trophy-taking, and the underlying role of isolation. To the families of victims, it is a reminder of how their loved ones were desecrated in a manner that feels profoundly dehumanizing. A single phrase, 4 words, stands as the symbol of a tragedy so staggering that it altered Milwaukee's sense of safety and left the global public grappling with how to categorize evil of this magnitude. A city's reflection, tearing down the past. Even after Jeffrey Dahmer's death in 1994, the city of Milwaukee found itself unable to simply turn the page. The Oxford Apartments on North 25th Street, where much of Dahmer's horror had played out, became a grim symbol of tragedy. Although the building still housed other tenants with nowhere else to go, it was effectively stigmatized. Neighbors spoke of unease, visitors gawked at the structure, and potential renters shunned any vacant unit. A public campaign soon took shape, driven by local activists and victim advocacy groups, urging that the entire structure be razed to eliminate any vestiges of Dahmer's crimes. Many believed leaving the building intact served as a macabre monument, enticing the morbidly curious. Family members of the victims worried that it could become a site of dark tourism, subjecting the neighborhood to ongoing sensationalism. Demolition and memorial plans in 1992, not long after the trial, the Oxford Apartments were indeed vacated and then demolished. A chain-link fence went up while bulldozers roared of bricks and rubble tumbled to the ground. For some, watching the physical space vanish offered a semblance of release, a final blow against the shadow that had loomed over the neighborhood. Yet the lot remained empty for years as investors hesitated to back new construction on such emotionally charged ground. Various memorial ideas were floated: a park, a playground, even a modest reflective space to honor the victims. Yet debates arose over the most respectful approach. Some relatives of the murdered men preferred a discreet memorial, free of sensational signage. Others wanted a more prominent tribute to ensure these lives would not be forgotten. Unfortunately, as time passed, consensus proved elusive, and for a lengthy period, the space sat in an ambiguous limbo, grass reclaiming the spot where the apartment building once stood. Neighborhood transformation Milwaukee officials recognized that demolishing one building was only a small piece of addressing deeper issues. The Dahmer case had exposed cracks in community trust and law enforcement. Lock clubs, neighborhood watch programs, and community policing initiatives slowly expanded in an effort to foster tighter bonds. Over the next decade, the vicinity around 25th Street saw slow improvements, renovated houses, a renewed sense of pride, and a cautious optimism that overshadowed the site's grim legacy. Nevertheless, the memory of Dahmer lingered. Tourists occasionally asked local residents, where did the Milwaukee cannibal live? To many, these inquiries were intrusive, a reminder that even after the physical building was gone, the story had become an inescapable part of the city's identity, woven into its collective history as both a cautionary tale and a source of enduring sorrow. Lionel Dahmer's account, a father's story. Amid the public furor, Dahmer's father, Lionel, tried to reconcile his memories of a quiet boy who once collected tadpoles in jars with the monstrous man who had been convicted of unspeakable acts. As the trial concluded and the dust settled, Lionel penned a book titled A Father's Story, released in 1994. Far from a standard true crime account, it was part memoir, part introspective quest, a father struggling to make sense of how his son had devolved into a notorious murderer. The content of the memoir in the pages of a father's story, Lionel traced Jeffrey's childhood with meticulous detail. The early fascination with dissecting animals, the fractures in the Dahmer household, and the missed warning signs that, in hindsight, loomed large. Lionel admitted to having been emotionally distant, preoccupied with his own scientific pursuits and with the crumbling marriage to Joyce. He recounted that, when Jeffrey was a teenager, he noticed the boy's isolation and alcohol abuse, but never suspected the lethal fantasies brewing beneath the surface. Beyond simply recounting facts, the book revealed Lionel's guilt. He pondered whether his genetic contributions or his own quiet disposition somehow predisposed Jeffrey toward violence. He worried about the example he had set, whether an early fascination with chemistry inadvertently nurtured his son's fixation on dissolution and preservation of remains. In heartbreakingly candid passages, Lionel weighed the idea of parental responsibility, concluding that while Jeffrey's actions were ultimately his own, the environment in which he was raised might have contributed to the psychological stew that birthed a murderer. Public reception, A Father's Story, drew a spectrum of reactions. Some readers sympathized with Lionel, acknowledging the agony of a parent grappling with an unimaginable truth. Others viewed it with suspicion, calling it opportunistic or exploitative. At times, the families of the victims expressed dismay, feeling that any profit from the Dahmer name was blood money. Lionel offered to share proceeds with certain charitable causes, but controversies lingered, demonstrating how even the most earnest confessions could stir anger among those impacted by Jeffrey's crimes. Insight or justification? Critics debated whether the memoir offered genuine psychological insight or simply rationalized monstrous behavior. Although Lionel acknowledged his son's guilt and never condoned the murders, he also described moments of paternal love, memories of fishing trips, small interactions that painted Jeffrey as more than just a monster. This duality unsettled readers who believed no human warmth could exist in one who had committed such cruelty. In the end, A Father's Story served as a deeply personal narrative, reflecting how Dahmer's crimes devastated not only strangers and victims' families, but also his own kin, who were left wrestling with love and revulsion in equal measure. The role of media, documentaries, films, and public debate, from the earliest headlines reporting Milwaukee man arrested after grisly discovery, Jeffrey Dahmer's story caught fire in the media. Tabloids played up the lurid details, focusing on cannibalism and fridge horrors. More established outlets, including major TV networks and newspapers, tried for a more balanced approach, investigating systemic failures and the psychological complexities of a cannibalistic serial killer. Over time, an entire industry of Dahmer-related books, documentaries, and dramatized retellings would surface, each claiming to offer new revelations or angles. Early documentaries and specials in the years immediately following his arrest, primetime news programs like Dateline NBC or 20 by 20 ran hour-long specials featuring interviews with neighbors, former classmates, and law enforcement. The revelations, particularly about missed opportunities to rescue Conoric Synthemphone, sparked national indignation. Documentarians zeroed in on those pivotal moments, such as how close Dahmer came to being caught multiple times. Some programs portrayed Dahmer with a veneer of empathetic inquiry, stressing the tragic underpinnings of mental illness. Others hammered home the moral revulsion, labeling him an irredeemable monster. Dramatized adaptations by the late 1990s, direct-to-video films, and made-for-TV movies began to appear. These dramatizations typically used sensational marketing tactics, recreating scenes of Dahmer's crimes with shaky camera angles, ominous music, and fictional dialogues. Victims' families often objected, arguing that the productions exploited real suffering for entertainment. Legal battles occasionally erupted over the use of victims' names or dramatized content. Ethical questions. As the media coverage exploded, ethical concerns became front and center. Where does legitimate public interest end and voyeuristic sensationalism begin? Many critics decried the gory reenactments, pointing out that the real tragedy lay in the irreparable damage inflicted on actual human beings. Others contended that such coverage brought necessary awareness to policing lapses, systemic discrimination, and mental health negligence. Nonetheless, the appetite for true crime content only grew, leading to ongoing moral dilemmas about balancing public curiosity with respect for victims. Ongoing legacy into the 21st century, the Dahmer case remained a potent subject. Streaming services commissioned docu-series or mini-series about him. True crime podcasts devoted multi-episode arcs to dissecting the minutiae of each murder. The overarching question, how does a quiet man become one of America's deadliest serial killers, continued to fascinate. Yet for many Milwaukee residents, repeated retellings felt like an unending re-traumatization. The city's name became almost inseparable from Dahmer in the international imagination, overshadowing its culture, industries, and benign Midwestern charm. Academic and psychological studies. If the general public fixated on the sensational details, the scholarly community took a more methodical approach. Psychologists, criminologists, and forensic psychiatrists dissected every available detail of Dahmer's background, his confessions, and his modus operandi in an effort to glean insights into the nature of serial murder, extreme paraphilias, and the interplay of mental illness and criminal behavior. Necrophilia, cannibalism, and control. Jeffrey Dahmer's case is notable for multiple extreme factors: necrophilia, sexual attraction to corpses, anthropophagy, cannibalism, and bizarre zombie-making experiments. In academic circles, these behaviors represent the farthest reaches of paraphilic disorder, rare and poorly understood. By correlating Dahmer's descriptions with known clinical frameworks, scholars examine whether he presented a form of sexual sadism or a unique paraphilic condition, combining necrophilia with a desperate need for companionship. Many concluded his crimes reflected a lethal blend of pathological loneliness, eroticized violence, and a compulsion for absolute control. Alcohol abuse and its role. Another key focus of these studies was the role of substance dependence. Dahmer admitted he was rarely sober when luring or killing victims. Alcohol, in his words, dulled the moral or empathetic inhibitions that might have otherwise held him back. Some researchers hypothesized that, absent chronic alcohol use, Dahmer may have been more inhibited or less impulsive. While it hardly absolves him of responsibility, it underscores how addiction and violent pathology can intersect in especially destructive ways. Nature versus nurture. Echoing lines from Lionel Dahmer's own reflections, academics debated how much of Jeffrey's development was determined by environment versus biology. Some posited that genetic predispositions, possible predisposition to mental disorders, a limited capacity for empathy, intersected fatally with the childhood trauma of parental discord and social isolation. Others pointed out that countless individuals experience familial strife without turning to homicide, let alone the extremes Dahmer reached. The consensus, if one existed, was that no single factor created Jeffrey Dahmer, or rather, a constellation of personal vulnerabilities, environmental stressors, and chance events converged to forge an unthinkable outcome. Criminological significance. Beyond the psychology, criminologists often refer to Dahmer's case in discussions of how repeated low-level crimes, indecent exposure, drugging men, failed to trigger interventions that might have flagged him earlier. They cited it as a glaring example of a system that responded in piecemeal fashion, losing track of the bigger picture until it was far too late. Thus, the Dahmer saga found its way into police training academies and social work courses, providing lessons on the importance of cross-agency collaboration, thorough investigative practices, and cultural sensitivity. Spiritual and philosophical inquiries. Debating evil, the sheer brutality and unnaturalness of Dahmer's actions stirred profound philosophical inquiries about the nature of evil. Traditional definitions of evil frequently revolve around the conscious choice to inflict suffering, yet Dahmer's case added the layer of psychological compulsion. Could a man whose deviance stemmed from paraphilic impulses and a distorted sense of loneliness be morally judged the same as a murderer who kills for material gain or sadistic pleasure? Theological reflections. Religious communities, ranging from Christian churches to interfaith groups, approached Dahmer's story with caution. Some pastors publicly condemned his crimes as the work of Satan or absolute moral depravity. Others suggested that if Dahmer sincerely repented and found God in prison, redemption might still be possible. This position outraged many victims' relatives who believed no measure of piety could erase such monstrous deeds. Meanwhile, theologians used Dahmer as a case study in discussions about free will and divine justice. If one's psyche is so broken that rational choice is impaired, how does that figure into spiritual accountability? Some insisted that free will, however diminished, could never be fully eradicated. Dahmer still performed calculated actions, hid evidence, and chose to kill. Others advanced a more nuanced debate about mental illness mitigating moral culpability. These debates rarely reached consensus, but underscored the profound spiritual weight carried by his crimes. Philosophical questions of empathy beyond religion. Philosophers probed whether Dahmer's near-complete lack of empathy signified a deficiency in moral reasoning or an inability to empathize at all. Did he ever see his victims as fully human, or did he cognitively reduce them to objects necessary for his twisted fantasies? The answer had broad implications for understanding moral psychology. If empathy is a cornerstone of ethical behavior, Dahmer's acts represented a total empathy void, heightening philosophical reflection on the fragile lines that separate typical human behavior from horrifying extremes. Societal evil or individual aberration. Moreover, some commentators wondered if society itself bore any blame, from the subculture that marginalized LGBTQ+ individuals to policing practices that neglected minority neighborhoods, to insufficient mental health outreach. They pondered if these collective oversights allowed Dahmer's pathology to flourish, a question that speaks to the concept of structural or systemic evil. Others contended that he was simply an outlier, a grim aberration whose existence did not necessarily reflect on broader society. Here, too, the conversation remains split, pointing to complex entanglements of individual agency and societal responsibility. Victim advocacy and healing movements, while academic circles focused on deeper interpretations, a parallel wave of grassroots efforts emerged to support families and survivors, aiming to ensure that tragedies like this might, if not be fully prevented, at least be better handled. They formed in the immediate aftermath of the trial, evolving into long-term advocacy initiatives. Survivor networks, several mothers, sisters, and close friends of Dahmer's victims founded or joined groups specializing in grief counseling for those who lost loved ones to violent crime. These communities served as emotional lifelines. Members recognized how mainstream resources often provided generic counseling, but didn't account for the unique trauma of losing someone to a serial killer, especially a killer whose acts were so highly publicized. Group sessions allowed raw expression of anger, despair, and guilt without judgment. Outreach to marginalized communities. Many of Dahmer's victims were Black, Latino, or Southeast Asian, and some were gay or transient. Activists recognized that these populations had historically encountered skepticism or neglect when reporting crimes. In response, local nonprofits partnered with city agencies to improve cultural competency among police, and to streamline missing person reports. Educational workshops taught individuals how to advocate for themselves if they felt law enforcement wasn't taking a disappearance seriously. Over time, new protocols emerged for better record sharing among precincts, an incremental but vital step to ensure that repeated complaints about suspicious individuals might not be overlooked again. Aid and compensation, the concept of restitution for victim families, became another pressing issue. Without a standard victims' compensation fund in place for crimes of such magnitude, some families faced financial burdens, funeral expenses, lost wages from taking time off to chase police reports, and mental health care costs for prolonged therapy. Wisconsin, like other states, possessed limited victim compensation programs, but the scale of the Dahmer case tested those resources. Nonprofit fundraisers attempted to bridge gaps. Still, many felt that no amount of money could truly alleviate the anguish inflicted. Public memorials and vigils, annual memorial gatherings emerged, especially during significant anniversaries of the murders, such as a year after the trial verdict or the day the Oxford apartments were demolished. Participants lit candles, read the victims' names, and dedicated moments of silence. These commemorations served as collective healing rituals, offering a space to reflect on the men whose identities were often overshadowed by the notoriety of their killer. In a city still grappling with moral aftershocks, such acts underscored the unity and empathy that can flourish after profound tragedy. Comparisons to other serial killers inevitably Jeffrey Dahmer's crimes drew comparisons to other infamous murderers across history: Jack the Ripper, Ed Gein, Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy. Each name stirs a unique brand of horror. Yet Dahmer's case set itself apart in key respects, shaping how the public and experts classified his motivations and deviance. Cannibalism and trophies. While Ed Gein infamously fashioned items from human remains, Dahmer's focus on cannibalism and necrophilia distinguished him from Gacy, whose crimes, though equally horrifying, did not extend to such extremes. Dahmer's admission that he consumed certain body parts to feel closer to his victims or to keep them with him forever offered chilling new territory in the study of psychosexual pathology. Motive and manipulation. Ted Bundy was known for feigning injury or helplessness to lure female victims, exuding a superficial charm. Dahmer's approach, though also manipulative, revolved around the promise of money, photos, or casual companionship. While Bundy engaged in violent sexual assaults, his fundamental drive seemed rooted in a sadistic hatred or objectification of women. Dahmer's impetus was more about possession and control, born from his deep-seated loneliness. This nuance shaped how criminologists labeled them: Bundy as a cunning predator of opportunity, Dahmer as a psychologically tormented deviant seeking twisted intimacy. Victim pool. John Wayne Gacy preyed on teenage boys in suburban Chicago, burying them beneath his house. Dahmer similarly targeted young men, but operated within an urban environment, approaching bars and the LGBTQ+ scene. Both exploited trust, but their outward personas diverged significantly. Gacy was a well-known local figure who threw block parties and dressed as a clown for charity events, whereas Dahmer was socially reclusive, awkward, and unassuming. Lessons for profilers in comparing these killers. FBI profilers refined typologies of organized versus disorganized murders, sexually motivated homicides, and the interplay of mental illness with criminal cunning. Dahmer's methodology, some aspects meticulously planned, others impulsive, confounded neat categorization. He exemplified a predator who could both plan advanced concealment techniques, acid dissolutions, and simultaneously act out bizarre fantasies spontaneously. The result was a complicated figure who advanced the conversation on how law enforcement identifies serial patterns in marginalized communities. Continuing ripples, cultural and political impact, even decades after Dahmer's crimes. Their reverberations continue to shape public policy, cultural dialogues, and local Milwaukee identity. The city wrestles with how to remember a tragedy that put it on the map for reasons nobody wanted. Political ramifications. Not long after the Dahmer revelations, pressure mounted on Milwaukee's mayor and city council to implement reforms in law enforcement. Public trust was at a low ebb. This climate played a role in mayoral elections, with candidates pledging better oversight of the police department, more robust community outreach, and vigilant accountability for officers. Though some attempts floundered amid budget constraints, a more engaged electorate pushed local politicians to keep policing reforms on the agenda. Media responsiveness. Nationally, journalists cited the Dahmer case whenever discussing how the press covers sensational murders. Over time, certain editorial guidelines evolved. Mainstream outlets now strive to highlight the names and stories of victims rather than focusing solely on the killer. In short, the media recognized that placing the murderer at the center of every article risked glamorizing atrocities. Subsequent high-profile cases, from Columbine to subsequent serial killers, saw more deliberate coverage that balanced the public's right to know with ethical considerations on how to handle survivors and victim families. Art and expression in unexpected corners. The legacy of Dahmer seeped into art. Sculptors, painters, and performance artists used his story as a commentary on alienation, deviance, and societal failings. Some installations featured the symbolic empty lot where Oxford Apartments once stood, signifying the haunting space left behind by violence. Others engaged with themes of forced invisibility for marginalized communities. While some artistic endeavors offered thoughtful social critique, others were criticized as exploitative or shock-based. The line between provocative art and tasteless sensationalism was frequently debated, echoing the broader moral questions raised by the entire case. Personal freedoms versus security. One final political debate revolved around balancing individual rights with communal safety. Dahmer's spree made people question whether stricter oversight, random apartment searches, heavier police presence might have prevented the murders. Civil liberties advocates cautioned against overreach, warning that infringing on privacy to hunt for potential criminals could lead to discrimination and abuse of power. The tension remains unresolved in many American cities. The Dahmer episode crystallized how real the consequences can be when the system fails to notice or halt a predator in its midst. Conclusion. Living with the shadows. The name Jeffrey Dahmer endures as an emblem of a human capacity for darkness that defies comfortable explanations. His brand of violence, threaded with cannibalism, necrophilia, and elaborate concealments, provokes horror and fascination in equal measure. Yet, within that fixation lies a deeper caution. Behind the sensational headlines and gruesome details were real people, human beings with lives, families, and hopes who became tragic footnotes to a killer's story. What we leave behind despite the demolition of his apartment building, the removal of physical reminders, and Dahmer's own death, the emotional and cultural footprints persist. Families still mourn their loved ones. Advocates continue pushing for police reforms, and the city of Milwaukee has integrated the lessons of that grim era into ongoing dialogues about mental health, discrimination, and community cohesion. Lessons Learned. The saga underscores multiple takeaways. Systemic vulnerabilities. Dahmer exploited police oversights and societal biases to target marginalized individuals. Strengthening resources for missing persons, especially from disenfranchised communities, is vital. Importance of reporting. Neighbors often suspected wrongdoing, yet hesitated or gave up after limited responses. Today, community watch efforts emphasize persistence and thorough follow-ups. Mental health intervention. Dahmer exhibited alarming signs from youth, extreme social isolation, paraphilias, and substance dependence. Identifying and treating such extremes earlier might avert tragedies. though success is not guaranteed. Ethical media, the public's appetite for lurid details, does not absolve journalists from responsibility. Ethical guidelines now stress victim-centered reporting and broader contextual coverage. A broader humanity. Ultimately, the story of the bloody refrigerator file stands as a testament to extremes of the human condition, from Dahmer's own moral abyss to the resilience of victims, families who turned grief into activism. For every horrifying dimension of the case, there emerged a counterbalance of empathy and communal solidarity. Some who survived or lost loved ones found new purpose in activism, transforming personal anguish into constructive change. In the final reckoning, we are left with a paradox. Jeffrey Dahmer's atrocities are deeply singular, yet they echo universal themes of loneliness, deviance, institutional failure, and moral confrontation. His actions disquiet us precisely because they lay bare how fragile the boundaries of civility can be, and how vigilance, compassion, and justice must work in concert to hold society's fabric intact. The Milwaukee monster is gone, yet the cautionary lessons remain. As horrifying as Dahmer's case will always be, it imparts a sobering reminder. The greatest safeguard against darkness is a community that refuses to stay silent, demands accountability, and insists that every life, no matter how marginalized, warrants protection. Shadows in the public memory. In the years following Jeffrey Dahmer's death and the demolition of the Oxford apartments, the city of Milwaukee found itself in an uneasy relationship with its own memory. Traces of the case receded from the news cycle, replaced by more recent headlines, yet the Dahmer saga refused to vanish entirely. New residents, both local and from out of state, occasionally stumbled across references to a cannibal killer who once lived a few blocks away. Longtime residents, on the other hand, carried deeper scars. Lingering local silence, many in the immediate neighborhood where Dahmer prowled became guarded in discussing the crimes. A kind of quiet reticence settled in, as if naming the horror might somehow reinvigorate it. Cafe owners, bartenders, and hairdressers would nod solemnly whenever visitors asked about the Milwaukee monster, providing short, clipped answers. That was a tragedy, they might say. We've moved on now. Some businesses instituted an informal policy. Employees would not engage in lengthy Dahmer conversations, especially if they felt it contributed to lurid tourism rather than respectful inquiry. Yet silence has its own consequences. Local youth, some of whom were born after Dahmer's death, heard rumors about a real boogeyman, fueling curiosity in adolescent minds. Occasionally, a group of teenagers would wander to the fenced-off empty lot where the Oxford apartments once stood, half expecting to glimpse ghosts or sense an otherworldly presence. In small ways, the specter of Dahmer lingered, shaping urban folklore for the next generation. Short-lived true crime tours for a brief time. Enterprising guides advertised true crime tours around Milwaukee, promising to show visitors the key locations tied to Dahmer's life and capture the city's dark history. Flyers mentioned the bars he frequented, the chocolate factory where he worked, and the approximate site of his old apartment. Although some tourists found such tours educational, the immediate community's reaction was sharply negative. Neighbors argued that turning these spaces into a spectacle only reopened wounds. Protests and petitions soon pressurized local officials, ultimately pushing most commercial Dahmer-themed tours to cease operation. Cultural dichotomy. This uneasy dichotomy between people eager to bury the past and those drawn to its macabre details defined Milwaukee's public memory for a generation. Sociologists studying the phenomenon discovered it wasn't unique to Dahmer's case. Communities scarred by high-profile crimes often wrestle with collective identity. Some choose to reclaim the narrative by acknowledging the tragedy openly, while others opt to distance themselves, hoping time and silence will erode the memory. Milwaukee, it turned out, did a bit of both, forging a complex relationship to its darkest chapter. Unraveling the tapes. Inside Dahmer's interviews. While Dahmer's confessions were widely publicized in court documents and media reports, fewer people realized that extensive interviews, sometimes spanning hours, had been recorded by law enforcement, psychiatrists, or even would-be authors. These raw tapes contained a wealth of detail, some redundant, some contradictory. Over the years, partial transcripts leaked, fueling new debates. Psychological deep dive. In one set of interviews with detectives, Dahmer calmly recounted his earliest fantasies, describing them as fleeting daydreams that grew more powerful until they became unstoppable urges. He spoke in a monotone, at times stumbling over words, searching for precise descriptions of emotions he admitted he barely understood. Listeners of these tapes reported a strange sense of dissonance. How could the soft-spoken voice belong to someone capable of cannibalism? Criminologists who studied the tapes argued that the confessions displayed a careful compartmentalization of Dahmer's psyche. He could clinically detail the dismemberment of victims, describing it almost as a chore or mechanical process, yet occasionally express flickers of regret. Whether that regret was genuine remorse or simply regret at getting caught remained an open question. Competing narratives. Many hours of taped conversations also touched on Dahmer's childhood, offering up anecdotes about how it felt to live in a fractured household. He recalled his parents' frequent arguments and the sense of invisibility he felt as they drifted apart. Listeners might detect a lonely young man behind the killer, though survivors and experts alike warned against conflating loneliness with an excuse for murder. Mental health professionals analyzing these testimonies found them invaluable for mapping how early fixations, like dissecting roadkill, could mature into something infinitely more dreadful under the right, or rather wrong, confluence of circumstances. Ethical considerations. The question of whether to release the tapes publicly arose repeatedly. Some argued that they contained critical educational value for psychiatrists and law enforcement, helping them identify potential serial offenders in the future. Others felt airing Dahmer's voice, especially any sensational segments, unnecessarily re-traumatized families and gave the killer a final platform. Over time, partial transcripts and carefully edited excerpts did appear in documentary projects, but the raw, uncut versions generally stayed locked in evidence rooms, accessible only to select researchers. The moral line between public right to know and respecting victims' dignity remained heavily debated. A mother's burden. Joyce Dahmer and the weight of grief often overshadowed by Lionel Dahmer's memoir and interviews. Jeffrey's mother, Joyce Dahmer, carried her own private torment. She had divorced Lionel years before Jeffrey's arrest and struggled with her own mental health issues. The revelation that her firstborn son had become a notorious murderer devastated her psyche. Media coverage sometimes cast her as a distant or unstable figure in his upbringing, fueling rumors and half-truths about her alleged neglect. Post-arrest anguish. In the immediate wake of Jeffrey's arrest, Joyce found herself besieged by reporters. Some tabloids sought to blame her directly, dredging up allegations that her prescription drug use during pregnancy somehow predisposed Jeffrey to violent pathology. Though no evidence concretely linked maternal medication to cannibalistic urges, the stigmatizing speculation deeply hurt her. She relocated multiple times, trying to outrun that public scrutiny. Despite this, Joyce wrote letters to Jeffrey in jail, occasionally visiting him even after his conviction. Accounts vary on how these visits went. Prison records indicate short, tense dialogues. She apparently asked him repeatedly if there was anything she could have done differently, to which he often responded with sighs or minimal statements about fate and personal responsibility. Later years, Joyce lived in relative obscurity, working in different administrative or caregiving jobs, and at times volunteering for crisis helplines. She occasionally mentioned her experiences with women who had troubled children, hoping to offer them emotional support. Those who knew her in those final years recall a woman wearing sorrow like a heavy shawl. She rarely spoke of her son publicly after a few early interviews, preferring to keep her grief private, away from the unrelenting gaze of tabloids. When Joyce passed away in 2000 due to cancer, her funeral was small, attended by a handful of family members and close friends. A few reporters hovered outside, but found that the event offered little scoop. In her final notes, she reportedly wrote of loving Jeffrey despite everything, yet also grappling with unanswerable questions. In a sense, her life story became emblematic of how the blast radius of a serial killer's crimes extends far beyond the immediate victims. Investigative hindsight, path not taken hindsight, can be both clarifying and cruel. Decades after the Dahmer case concluded, retired law enforcement officials occasionally revisited the files, pondering crucial what-ifs. Would an integrated database of missing person reports have flagged the pattern sooner? Could advanced forensic technology, like modern-day DNA analysis, have revealed linkages between unsolved cases more quickly? The answers remain theoretical, illuminating potential paths not taken in the 1980s and early 1990s. Evolving police techniques by the 21st century, many police departments adopted robust computerized systems and shared databases across county or state lines. Cross-jurisdictional data allowed investigators to spot patterns in missing persons. In modern parlance, a future Jeff Dahmer might be flagged earlier for a suspicious cluster of associates vanishing after spending time with him. Of course, that's speculation, but it highlights how Dahmer's spree may have accelerated improvements in policing technology. Forensic science growth during Dahmer's active years, DNA testing was still in its relative infancy, not widely used in everyday investigations. In later decades, the cost of DNA profiling dropped, and more advanced methods emerged, such as familial DNA searching or large-scale data comparisons. If applied promptly, these methods could connect victims to their last known sightings, cross-reference phone records, or even find suspect hair/fiber evidence linking multiple crime scenes. Dahmer systematically evaded detection, partly because each homicide, though brutal, lacked the sort of ballistic or ballistic-like evidence that might appear in more common forms of murder. Yet, while advanced forensics can accelerate detection, many experts caution that no technology can replace the fundamental human factor of vigilance. Neighbors' calls and victim families' pleas must be taken seriously. The Dahmer saga is a stark reminder that ignoring or minimizing suspicious reports, particularly from marginalized communities, lets predators operate unimpeded. The human element ultimately, every retired detective or official reviewing the Dahmer files faced the emotional toll of knowing how close they came to stopping him earlier. Some recounted nightmares where they replayed the Connerex synthism phone incident in their minds, imagining an alternate reality where the boy was never returned to the killer. These reflections underline a profound lesson in policing. Behind each procedural slip lies the potential for catastrophic outcomes. Ongoing myths and urban legends, as with many high-profile crimes, misinformation and conspiracy theories inevitably sprouted around Dahmer's story. Some claimed he had accomplices, others believed he was part of an underground network of cannibals. None of these rumors held up under scrutiny, yet they circulated in the darker corners of the internet, fueling endless speculation. He was the pawn of a cult. One popular myth alleged that Dahmer had ties to a secretive satanic cult. The rumor suggested the bizarre dismemberments and ritualistic elements were part of occult ceremonies. Investigators, however, found no credible evidence of any group involvement. Dahmer's own confessions emphasized personal compulsion. He never mentioned external influences or conspiracies. Additional victims unaccounted for. Another frequent claim was that the official count of 17 victims underrepresented the real number. While it is true many serial killers exploit uncertain case closures, Dahmer consistently and thoroughly detailed each murder he committed once in custody. Forensic evidence corroborated his statements. Though some open missing person cases remain unsolved in the region, none have been definitively linked to Dahmer beyond his verified timeline. Authorities concluded it was unlikely he withheld any kills, given his remarkable frankness post-arrest. Haunted grounds urban legend enthusiasts insisted the vacant lot of the demolished Oxford apartments was haunted, its soil cursed by spilled blood. Teens told ghost stories of hearing disembodied cries or glimpsing apparitions. Local historians generally dismissed such tales as macabre folklore, understandable given the horrific crimes but lacking any factual basis. Occasional ghost hunting groups tried to investigate, only to come up empty-handed. While these legends shaped an eerie mystique in some circles, most Milwaukee residents remained grounded in the actual tragedy. The real horrors needed no supernatural embellishment. The factual details were terrifying enough on their own. Yet, the perpetuation of myths illustrated humanity's broader impulse to add layers of narrative to monstrous events, striving to make sense of, or at least distance oneself from, the raw brutality of reality. Renewed views on justice and punishment. Jeffrey Dahmer's sentence, 15 consecutive life terms, sparked an enduring conversation about whether extreme killers should face rehabilitative efforts, indefinite isolation, or capital punishment in states where it exists. While Wisconsin had abolished the death penalty long before Dahmer's trial, many voiced frustration that a murderer of such ferocity could remain alive at taxpayer expense. Others argued that life imprisonment was a harsher fate, forcing him to confront his guilt daily. Rehabilitation versus retribution. A minority of observers asserted that Dahmer's psychological problems might justify indefinite psychiatric care over standard incarceration. The conventional legal system's approach, punitive sentencing, did little to address the root causes of cannibalistic necrophilia. But the majority response was blunt. No therapy could excuse or mitigate the scale of his crimes. The families deserved retribution, not a drawn-out clinical experiment on whether Dahmer could be cured. At the same time, criminologists used the Dahmer case to understand that some individuals, particularly those with violent paraphilias, may be effectively beyond conventional rehabilitation. They contended that, for such extreme personalities, indefinite confinement might be the sole method to protect society. The question of moral redemption thus remained philosophical, overshadowed by pragmatic concerns about public safety. Was justice served? Upon Dahmer's murder in prison, the debate continued with fresh vigor. Some families felt cheated of the reassurance that each passing day behind bars would be a punishment. A slice of the public, on the other hand, believed the ultimate cosmic justice was served. Scarver's vigilante act, albeit illegal, ended a life marked by carnage. But vigilantism rarely finds broad approval in legal discourse, so scholars and ethicists pointed out that prison murder also signals failure, that a system meant to contain violence had witnessed more bloodshed on its watch. Ultimately, each stakeholder in the Dahmer tragedy walked away with their own sense of resolution or lack thereof. Courts had indeed convicted him, but the moral question of how best to handle irredeemable criminals lingers in penal policy discussions to this day. Reflections from the law enforcement community over time. The Milwaukee Police Department engaged in a kind of institutional reckoning. Training regimens were revamped, with mandatory segments focused on cultural competence and the importance of taking all citizen complaints seriously, no matter the context. Officers who had been active during the Dahmer era occasionally took part in internal seminars, recounting lessons learned from that harrowing case. A department transformed. In official statements, law enforcement leaders stated they had evolved from the days when homophobic assumptions or dismissals of minority neighborhoods might hamper investigations. New guidelines required thorough documentation of all missing person reports with systematic follow-ups. Additionally, the city introduced community liaison officers who regularly met with local activists, bridging the gap between disenfranchised communities and the police. Whether these measures fully erase the past's failings was subject to debate. Skeptics pointed to ongoing tensions nationwide between police and marginalized groups, emphasizing that the structural issues run deeper than a single high-profile crime. Yet, the department's attempts at introspection and improvement were evident, at least partially spurred by the shame of the Conoric synthesyphone blunder. Lasting influence elsewhere, the FBI and other agencies used Dahmer's case in behavioral science programs, demonstrating how serial killers with unusual paraphilias might slip through routine detection. Profilers dissected the psychological and logistical elements of Dahmer's spree for training modules, hoping future investigators would better recognize red flags. Beyond simply identifying patterns, they stressed empathy, realizing how ignoring a single frantic neighbor call might lead to devastation. Commemorating the victims, a renewed push by the mid-2000s, a new wave of victim advocacy groups, propelled by the children or siblings of the original victims, renewed calls for a permanent memorial. They argued that the city's attempts at closure would remain incomplete without a dedicated site or plaque that honored the dead by name, rather than referencing them merely as Dahmer's casualties. Naming the unnamed organizers compiled data on each individual, their personal histories, interests, hopes. They sought to humanize men, often overshadowed by the killer's monstrous legend. Where earlier proposals for memorials had stalled, this fresh impetus found some traction. Although a handful of community members worried about turning any site into a shrine that might attract the wrong kind of attention, most recognized the distinction between memorializing victims and glorifying a killer. Fundraising and design donations trickled in from across the country, including small amounts from people who had never set foot in Milwaukee but felt a kinship with the families. Artists submitted concepts for a modest monument, perhaps a sculpted bench or a plaque with all 17 names etched in steel. After extensive consultation with the families, the final design took shape, a simple, tasteful structure in a local green space, with each victim's name and date of birth inscribed. No mention of Dahmer would appear. This was a space for remembrance, not re-traumatization. Unveiling when the memorial was finally unveiled in a subdued ceremony, the atmosphere was heavy yet hopeful. Children laughed in a nearby playground. A group of supporters stood in a semicircle around the new monument. Some placed flowers, others lit candles. A pastor offered a short prayer, asking for continued healing and the determination to protect vulnerable individuals. The city's mayor gave a brief speech, acknowledging past failings while commending the community's resolve. Though the memorial was not without detractors, a few critics argued it dredged up the past unnecessarily. Most recognized it as an important step. By naming the victims, embracing their memory, not letting them remain mere footnotes, the city reaffirmed a commitment to empathy, progress, and accountability. It was a testament that, though evil once thrived here, compassion and unity stood ready to reclaim the narrative. The enduring moral puzzle, reflecting on the full breadth of Jeffrey Dahmer's life and crimes, one confronts a moral puzzle that has no simple resolution. On one hand, he was undeniably a calculating killer, cunning enough to hide evidence and lie to police. On the other, his compulsion was so extreme, rooted in necrophilia, cannibalism, and a frantic desire to stave off loneliness, that it eluded straightforward categorization as a typical organized serial murderer. Different aspects, same monster. In analyzing Dahmer, psychologists highlight the rare intersection of multiple pathologies, intense social isolation, sexual paraphilias, and an apparent near-total empathy deficit. He did not kill for money, nor did he appear to relish the terror of his victims in a typical sadistic sense. Rather, he viewed them as objects to be dominated, used, and ultimately consumed, literally or figuratively. This objectification stands as a chilling commentary on how total emotional disconnection can breed atrocities. Lessons unlearned? Decades later, society faces new crimes, new predators. The question persists: has the system improved enough to catch a future Dahmer before he racks up a staggering body count? Some say yes, pointing to advanced technology, better community police relations, and the universal cell phone culture that makes dropping off the grid more difficult. Others remain cautious. As new forms of social marginalization emerge, criminals who know how to exploit them might still slip through. A final word for the families of those who died at Dahmer's hands. The moral puzzle is more personal. They had no illusions about his mental illness. He was, to them, a cold-blooded murderer. They demanded and received a measure of legal closure. Yet the emotional resolution is forever incomplete, bound by heartbreak that defies neat philosophical conclusions. Ultimately, the Dahmer saga stands as a warning of what can happen when isolation, disregard, and the darkest recesses of human craving collide unchecked. Postscript. Looking to the future, though decades have passed, the story of Jeffrey Dahmer continues to inform conversations about public safety, mental health, and community vigilance. Documentaries still appear, each attempting to put new frames around old facts. Academic symposia delve into the interplay of deviant sexual psychology and serial homicide. True crime enthusiasts dissect details in podcasts and online forums, sometimes with sensitivity, sometimes with a prurient fascination. Hope in the wake of horror. Amid the lingering gloom, small rays of hope emerged. The victim advocacy groups that formed in the 1990s became national networks, providing resources and reassurance to those searching for missing loved ones. Criminal justice reformers point to incremental success in bridging the trust gap between police and historically neglected communities. And a new generation in Milwaukee inherits a city that, while still carrying an infamous name, has also grown in empathy. A human legacy one can only imagine how different the story might have been if earlier interventions, be they familial, communal, or professional, had recognized and thwarted Dahmer's destructive path. The tragedy stands as a stark reminder that evil, though it may appear rare, can emerge from the most unremarkable places if left unchecked. Countering it demands a collective willingness to stay attuned to each other's well-being, to question the unexplained, and to hold authorities accountable. Thus, the final lesson of the Jeffrey Dahmer case may be less about dissecting the labyrinth of his psyche and more about shining a light on the vulnerabilities in our communities. When we fail to see or hear those who are different, when we brush aside people's cries for help, we open the door for predators to roam among us. Yet, when we stand together, neighbors, friends, officials, families, vigilance becomes a shield. If even one life is saved by remembering these lessons, then some fraction of good can be salvaged from an event that once cast a smothering shadow over Milwaukee. Shifts in forensic psychology as the public grappled with the terrifying extremes of Jeffrey Dahmer's actions. Forensic psychology underwent a quiet transformation. Before Dahmer, textbooks on paraphilic homicide often cited earlier figures like Ed Gein or Albert Fish. After Dahmer, his case became a central exhibit in discussions of psychological profiling. Researchers constructed more nuanced frameworks for mapping an offender's internal motivations, including necrophilia, cannibalism, and zombie-making fantasies. Where older theories labeled such behavior unthinkable, The Dahmer case forced experts to think harder, to dissect, classify, and attempt to understand. Precision of profiling investigators refining serial killer profiles had relied heavily on standard categories like organized versus disorganized, visionary killer, or hedonistic killer. Dahmer, however, bridged multiple traits. Deliberate disposal methods, organized, coexisted with bizarre, impulsive acts, disorganized. His compulsion was driven less by sadistic joy and more by a pathological terror of abandonment fused with twisted sexuality. This complexity prompted profilers to evolve a more fluid approach, acknowledging that a single criminal could exhibit multiple subsets of behavior. Teaching tools university programs offering degrees in criminal justice or forensic psychology integrated Dahmer's documented confessions and interrogation tapes into their curricula. Students pored over these resources, analyzing how deeply he planned victim encounters versus how unpredictably he carried them out. Professors also highlighted the missed red flags, like repeated sexual offenses or bizarre experiments, underscoring the importance of early intervention. Dahmer's story became a grim but potent lesson. Methodical investigation must not dismiss weird or improbable reports as mere oddities. Influence on modern-day policing parallel to advancements in forensic psychology. Dahmer's crimes impacted real-world policing strategies. By the 2000s and beyond, many large U.S. police departments instituted more robust oversight of repeat offenders, particularly those with violent sexual histories. The aim was to prevent another scenario where a single individual could repeatedly drug or assault vulnerable people without drawing serious scrutiny. Improved information sharing. One immediate reform was the expansion of centralized databases that track violent sexual predators. When Dahmer was active, local precincts lacked integrated data systems. A suspect's prior arrests or odd behaviors in one district might be invisible to officers elsewhere. In contrast, modern systems alert investigators across jurisdictions if multiple incidents share a suspect's name, address, or distinctive modus operandi. While no system is foolproof, experts widely believe that a contemporary Jeffrey Dahmer might not remain hidden for as long. Collaborative community policing. Dahmer's case demonstrated the devastating consequences when residents' concerns go unheard. The repeated calls about suspicious smells or a dazed underage boy on the street were ignored or downplayed, often due to prejudice against marginalized groups. Consequently, many cities began assigning liaison officers specifically trained to work with LGBTQ+ communities, immigrant populations, and other frequently overlooked groups. These officers attend community events, respond swiftly to tips, and cultivate trust. Policing experts contend that bridging this gap might reduce the odds of another predator exploiting systemic ignorance or bias. New research on deviant sexuality, the psychological underpinnings of cannibalism and necrophilia, remain largely uncharted territory, so Dahmer's confessions provided a grim case study for researchers. While no one championed him as a model, his candor post-arrest allowed psychologists to see how certain fixations evolved over decades, intertwining with alcohol dependency and repressed loneliness. Nature, nurture, and extremes investigations into Dahmer's genetic or neurological predispositions never unearthed a singular evil gene, but they did spawn deeper interest in whether certain neurochemical imbalances or structural brain anomalies might predispose some individuals to extreme paraphilias. Data gleaned from Dahmer's interviews hinted that environmental factors, lack of family cohesion, adolescent isolation, magnified underlying vulnerabilities. The interplay of these forces remains complex, demonstrating that there is rarely a single cause behind such aberrant violence. Ethical dilemmas in treatment. Scholars also debated if specialized therapy could ever mitigate impulses as severe as Dahmer's. Opponents of this notion insisted that once someone crosses the threshold into repeated murderous behavior, particularly with cannibalistic or necrophilic dimensions, the possibility of recovery is negligible. Others argued that early, aggressive interventions, especially during adolescence, might prevent the escalation of lethal fantasies. While the subject is both ethically fraught and painfully speculative, it underscores a crucial question. What if society had recognized Dahmer's dangerous fixations earlier? Continuing impact on popular culture documentaries revisited. Long after initial documentaries about Dahmer aired in the 1990s, new waves of true crime filmmaking emerged with the advent of streaming platforms. Directors seeking fresh angles interviewed lesser-known figures. The manager at a local hardware store who recalled Dahmer buying chemicals, a school nurse who faintly remembered his high school persona, or an ex-army colleague haunted by rumors. These new vantage points broadened the narrative mosaic, but also risked overshadowing the victims' voices. Critical reception, while each new production pledged exclusive insights or rare footage, critics questioned whether repeated retellings contributed anything truly new or simply rehashed the same horrors. Some documentaries, however, made genuine strides by foregrounding the family's perspectives, dedicating screen time to the victims' stories, identities, and dreams. This approach helped counterbalance the historical trend of spotlighting the killer's psychology at the expense of those he destroyed. Viewer response: modern audiences, accustomed to binge-watching criminal docu-series, often engaged in online debates about the ethics of consuming such content for entertainment. True crime fans argued that knowledge fosters vigilance, that ignoring reality doesn't help. Others felt uneasy about the potential to exploit real-life suffering for sensationalism. In essence, the Dahmer story remained a litmus test for how society grapples with the morality of true crime media. Portrayals in fiction and drama. Dahmer's case found its way into fictional adaptations, some direct, some oblique. Stage plays dramatized the trial, capturing the tense interplay between defense psychiatrists and prosecutors. Novelists penned thrillers featuring killers loosely based on Dahmer, sometimes set in different eras or locales. Television anthologies occasionally borrowed elements from his methods, like the lure of photography or the sinister fridge motif, without naming him explicitly. Artistic license versus facts. Not all fictional portrayals were respectful. Certain low-budget films sensationalized the gore, distorting timelines or suggesting conspiracies for shock value. Meanwhile, high-minded dramatizations wrestled with deeper themes: the banality of evil, the heartbreak of mourning a missing child, or the psychological torment of living near unimaginable cruelty. In this creative territory, Dahmer became both a cautionary archetype and a gauge of how society processes horror through art. Victims' families speak out. Families of the deceased repeatedly expressed concern about portrayals that reduced their loved ones to nameless bodies or props. Some advocated for disclaimers or disclaimers in movie credits, clarifying that the film was fictionalized. Directors who engaged with families during production sometimes earned goodwill, integrating their feedback to maintain a measure of dignity. Even so, the push and pull between creative freedom and ethical storytelling persisted, reflecting the challenge of adapting real atrocities into narrative form. Online subcultures and true crime fandom. With the rise of internet communities, Dahmer's story gained new permutations. Message boards, social media groups, and dedicated true crime fandom sites dissected his timeline with forensic zeal. Some participants approached it as a historical puzzle, combing through court transcripts to piece together minor details. Others veered into unsettling territory, fetishizing or romanticizing the killer. Fandom versus education. While many online discussions served as thoughtful spaces for reflecting on law enforcement oversights or mental health failings, a smaller fringe indulged in serial killer idolization, praising Dahmer's intelligence or aesthetic. Families of victims found this disturbing, appealing to platform moderators to remove content that glorified murder. This tension underscored a larger digital phenomenon. How do we handle dangerous glorifications of real-world violence while preserving free expression? Regulation efforts. Some social networks instituted community guidelines banning content that lionized criminal acts or disparaged victims. True crime groups responded by self-policing, encouraging respectful language and disclaimers emphasizing that the subject matter was not to be glamorized. Over time, these internal codes of conduct tempered the worst excesses of crime worship, reminding participants that behind every sensational case lay real people and irreversible sorrow. Conversations with survivors and observers, neighbors' perspectives. Decades later, journalists revisited the Oxford Apartments neighborhood decades after the demolition, finding a mixture of relief and residual trauma. Some longtime residents, now elderly, insisted they rarely spoke of Dahmer anymore, choosing to preserve peace. Others felt a quiet guilt that more direct action could have saved lives had they insisted that the police do more. A few younger neighbors, who had grown up hearing hushed stories, expressed determination to ensure no one else could hide in plain sight that way again. Healing through community, local civic groups tried to replace the building's dark memory with positive events, block parties, communal gardens, and neighborhood alliances. Over time, these events helped neighbors forge a sense of collective identity. They recognized that cynicism and silence had once enabled a predator. Community spirit and open communication were the antidotes. While no single barbecue or cleanup event could erase the city's heartbreak, these small steps represented resilience. Insights from journalists and attorneys, those who covered the Dahmer case in real time or argued it in court, emerged with indelible memories. Some journalists described struggling with nightmares long after broadcasting the bloody refrigerator revelations. They recounted how, in the frenzy of deadlines, they barely paused to process the magnitude of the suffering. Only when the cameras switched off did the reality set in. For attorneys, on both prosecution and defense, the trial was a watershed moment in their careers. Prosecutors gleaned a profound sense of responsibility in ensuring ironclad cases for unstoppable criminals. Defense lawyers wrestled with the moral complexities of defending someone whose guilt was undeniable, yet who might have legitimate mental health issues. In interviews years later, they described the unique tension between wanting to fulfill their constitutional duty and grappling with personal revulsion at the crimes. Ethical journalism revisited media professionals who worked the Dahmer beat, started adopting a more victim-centric approach in subsequent cases, emphasizing names and backgrounds of the deceased, avoiding lurid speculation, and disclaiming rumors. This ethical shift pointed to a subtle but real transformation spurred by the horror they had witnessed. The lines between sensational coverage and conscientious reporting were redrawn in newsrooms across Milwaukee and beyond. Reflections from emergency responders, in addition to police, paramedics, and firefighters, also bore witness to the aftermath of Dahmer's crimes. Some assisted at the final scene in 1991, removing body parts from the apartment or providing on-site first aid to a traumatized Tracy Edwards. A handful recounted that they had never experienced anything remotely so grisly or psychologically harrowing. Post-traumatic stress symptoms haunted many, who found it hard to shake the smell of decay or the image of severed heads. Support systems evolved, recognizing the toll such events take on frontline responders. Local emergency service departments eventually instituted better mental health support, mandatory debriefings after critical incidents, peer counseling programs, and specialized training in handling psychologically disturbing scenes. Paramedics who faced the Dahmer apartment said these policies came too late for them, but they were relieved to see the next generation more protected from the silent ravages of trauma. enduring ruminations, continuing lessons for the future. The Jeffrey Dahmer saga, now decades old, stands as both a cautionary tale and a testament to human resilience. A man consumed by depraved impulses lived undetected for years, thanks in part to systemic failures and society's unwillingness to confront the bizarre. Ultimately, his downfall resulted from the courage of a near victim and the unstoppable tide of truth once neighbors and law enforcement finally took notice. Ongoing vigilance even after so much time, city officials, advocacy groups, and mental health professionals continue citing Dahmer's crimes when discussing how to handle red flag behaviors, predatory actions, and public apathy. Present-day Milwaukee prides itself on being more proactive, a city watchful against those who might exploit the shadows. Modern outreach programs address not only the city's marginalized populations, but also potential offenders, urging them to seek help before crossing irredeemable lines. Legacy of compassion. For those who insist we must remember the victims, the message is clear. Compassion and vigilance are society's best defenses against such horrors. The illusions of "it can't happen here" or "he seems normal enough" unravel quickly when confronted by a predator who can wear an ordinary face. If anything, the tragedy reaffirms that every life deserves attention, every disappearance warrants urgency, and every neighbor's concern merits follow-up. Turning pain into purpose, some families and activists have harnessed their grief for purposeful change, campaigning for robust missing person protocols, funding mental health resources, or working with at-risk youth. These small but meaningful transformations illustrate humanity's capacity to glean hope and progress, even from the darkest nightmares. They stand in contrast to Dahmer's legacy of loss, offering a glimmer of positivity amid reflection. Chapter 51, closing the chapter. Though volumes have been written and broadcast about Jeffrey Dahmer, the full scope of his impact can never be entirely quantified. Families carry wounds that never fully heal. A city recollects sorrow overshadowed by ongoing revitalization. Criminologists keep referencing the case as a hallmark of terrifying extremes and cautionary oversights. And yet, amid the heartbreak, human decency endures. The same city that once housed a secret chamber of nightmares has proven it can unify, adapt, and strive to protect its most vulnerable. The final word may belong to those who lost loved ones but still found a way forward, transforming anguish into advocacy, ensuring that while memory of the Milwaukee monster remains, it is outshone by the collective commitment to empathy and justice. In that sense, the story of Jeffrey Dahmer, for all its horror, also reveals the quiet heroism and compassion that bloom in tragedies' wake. It is a reminder that while darkness may sometimes go unnoticed, once exposed, it cannot endure the determined, watchful solidarity of a caring community.